In your opinion, as a superintendent, did you feel that this email had a positive or negative impact on the staff? And if so, why or why not?
I think it had a negative impact on the staff in that, number one, I received future complaints about a basic frustration of they're trying to instruct students and they're being pulled into a personnel matter.
Did you take any steps in reaction to the receipt of this correspondence?
I did. I asked that the principal report to my office, and he did so at or about 11:30 a.m. on that day.
And that on that occasion, did you discuss this email with Mr. Foley?
I did discuss the email. When I asked the principal about the email, he stated he didn't mean to send it. I responded, you didn't mean to send it. You listed the entire listserv and CC'd 3 people on the school committee who voted on your position last night. You tell me you didn't mean to send it. He then did say yes, he did send the email.
Did you have any further conversation?
Very brief conversation, at the conclusion of which I directed him to turn his keys into Mr. Draper, and he did so, and he left the office.
And did you place him on paid administrative leave at that point?
That is correct. At that point, he was placed on paid administrative leave.
And from that point forward, has Mr. Foley continued to receive all due compensation under his contract and benefits?
He has.
Other than being deprived of gaining admission to this high school, has he been deprived of any other rights or benefits under his contract?
He is not.
Okay. So is it fair to say paid administrative leave is tantamount to a vacation for that time period?
Essentially, yes.
Object.
Ladies and gentlemen, objection to that question.
Mr. McAtee, what's your objection?
It's for one thing. It is not. It can't be paid administrative. It cannot be a paid vacation. It is a disciplinary matter. We are here on a disciplinary situation. For them to change the subject now to say, "Do you bring everyone before you who goes on vacation when they want to come back?" Objection to that question.
Do I need to
Mr.
respond?
Scanzio?
That's not a valid legal objection to the question, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Scanzio, I think Mr. McAtee is objecting to the characterization that it's a vacation as opposed to a paid suspension. And I think the record is clear on the testimony of the superintendent that, in fact, Mr. Foley was placed on a paid suspension by way of the testimony that has so far been elicited. So your objection is on the record, Mr. McAtee. I'm going to overrule the objection. The record stands for itself. This was not a vacation. This was a suspension with pay. From the testimony that's been elicited so far.
The question is has that objection been overruled or sustained?
The objection at this point in time has been overruled because it was not a valid objection to. The reason for the objection was not valid, but the statement on the record is such that the record itself reflects this is a paid suspension.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, would you like to be heard on that point?
Sure.
It's not a paid suspension because he hasn't been suspended from anything. He's received all his benefits. It was a paid administrative leave. The contract.
I apologize, Mr. Scanzio. It is a paid administrative leave.
Thank you. Could you explain to the committee what your purpose was in placing Mr. Foley on immediate administrative paid leave at that point?
My purpose was to get the high school on track in terms of teaching and learning. Quite frankly, I had major concerns over the principal's actions on this day and future actions. And this morning I have him clearly being insubordinate to me. I have him emailing the high school faculty and I needed to get the high school back on track in terms of teaching and learning.
Dr. Thornton.
Push for, yeah,
Did you have concerns about the effects on the student body if Mr. Foley were allowed to remain in the school at that point in time?
I did, given the actions at that point, I had serious concerns in terms of keeping the principal in the building.
And did you have concerns about the impact on the staff if Mr. Foley were allowed to remain in the school at that point in time?
I did.
Did you have concerns for Mr. Foley remaining in the school given his actions up to that point in time?
I did. To me, insubordination is a major, major concern. Fundamental to a school organization is the leadership chain, and insubordination is something I find extremely concerning.
If this type of activity continued and you hadn't placed Mr. Foley on paid administrative leave, would you be before this committee? Would you be before this committee tonight asking for a stronger sanction as opposed to the 30-day suspension?
Can you say that again?
If this type of activity continued, and if you were allowed to stay in the high school at that point in time, would you be here before the committee making a recommendation for a stronger sanction?
I would. In my mind, the maelstrom that was created by the principal was extremely problematic. And to me, I had to stop the behavior and get the high school back on track.
What were the important things that the high school needed to be back on track on?
Sure. The high school, as you know, was up for a review from the state in terms of the commission's review for the PBGR process. And we received a letter prior indicating we had a substantial amount of work to do.
Objection. Irrelevant to this proceeding. We agreed on that beforehand. This is about a disciplinary matter, not any other issue of renewal or non-renewal.
Scanzio?
The purpose of this testimony does not go to renewal or non-renewal. It goes to the superintendent's concern as to why the high school needed to be placed back on track towards something. And I felt it important for the record and for the school committee to know what the superintendent meant by back on track. We don't intend in any detail really to go into these issues at this point, and we do not intend to talk about anything other than the issues that we agreed upon today.
Mr. McAtee.
It's irrelevant to the proceeding. It's completely irrelevant to the proceeding. He was suspended for allegedly misusing an email system, not because of his performance as principal of the high school.
Well, I don't. I think the superintendent. It's a fair question to the superintendent to ask him why he felt it was such a maelstrom as far as the word that was used. Very concerning to him, and it seems to me that he's just expressing an opinion as to the basis of what his reasoning was. I'm going to ask. I'm going to allow him to answer, but I'm not. We're not going to go too far down this road. Mr. Thompson, you have anything else to add?
Oh, sorry. Essentially, just to rephrase, the high school had a great deal of work to do. And in my mind, focusing on a personnel matter was not what we needed to do at that point in time. The high school needed to be laser focused on the upcoming work at hand. And to me, I had to get the high school focused on that.
Before we go any further, may I see the two attorneys here at the table, please? have already. Without any objection to that document.
Please continue.
Your previous testimony was that you called Mr. Foley into your office, and you explained to him what your issue was, and you elicited a response from him. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as a result of that, you placed him on paid administrative leave. Is that correct?
That's correct.
At some point, based on the information that you received from all sources, including what Mr. Foley told you, did you make a determination as to whether or not it would be appropriate to have a sanction in terms of discipline?
I did.
And is that embodied in correspondence of January 5th, 2010?
It is.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that that be labeled Exhibit 4. Mr. Chairman, that's a 5-page exhibit. It includes the 2-page letter from January 5th, 2010. It includes a copy of a letter forwarded on November 25th, 2009 to Mr. Foley from Superintendent Thornton. It includes a correspondence dated October 30th, 2009 from Mr. Thornton to Mr. Foley, and a copy of Rhode Island General Laws 16-12.1-3 in compliance with the law. I'd ask that that come in as a full exhibit, Mr. Chairman.
McAtee? No objection. Shall be marked as full, number 4, employer.
Now, I note the date of this correspondence is January 5th, 2010, Mr. Thornton. Could you indicate to the committee why there was such a lapse of time between the date that you made a determination and the date you originally put Mr. Foley on paid administrative leave?
Sure. Initially, when the paid admin leave began, it was my understanding that attorneys on both sides had the potential to work their matter through. Given that some time did lapse, however, by on and about the holidays, it was clear that essentially would not be happening, thus the January 5th letter.
And did you originally receive information from legal counsel from the committee that settlement or resolution negotiations were in process?
I did.
And did you receive information from legal counsel on or before the 5th that those had broken down?
I did.
And in response to that, you were advised at that point to forward this correspondence out as promptly as possible?
That's correct.
And you forwarded this correspondence to Mr. Foley on January 5th, 2010. Is that correct?
Correct.
Up until the date of this hearing, has Mr. Foley been maintained of all his benefits and pay?
He has.
Now, in this correspondence, you outline what your recommendation would be?
I do.
And could you indicate to the committee what that recommendation is?
I've recommended a 30-day suspension without pay.
Did you also recommend that this correspondence would be placed in his personnel file and serve as a written reprimand for his actions?
I did.
Now, when you had discussions with Mr. Foley, did you come to a determination that his actions in sending the email out were willful and intentional?
In the meeting with Mr. Foley and myself and Mr. Draper, who was the witness, it was a short meeting. Mr. Foley did indicate he sent the email.
He indicated to you that he sent the email up by mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Did
Yes.
you consider that in making the determination of whether or not his actions were willful subordination?
I did, but quite frankly, I did not believe that this was a mistake. I
Could-
believe it was quite willful.
Could you explain to the committee why you came to that conclusion?
Yes. Essentially, creating an email, dropping down, picking a distribution list, taking the time to type in 3 members of school committee, writing the email in the email itself and not a Word document. I believe a great deal of time went into this. It was quite deliberate. I think clearly it was done prior to school on that morning and sent deliberately. It was, to me, clearly and willfully insubordinate.
Could you explain to the committee why an act of insubordination such as this would merit a 30-day unpaid suspension?
Fundamental to a school organization is leadership, chain of command. Essentially, this email erodes that entire process. You have to keep the integrity of a school district to ensure we have teaching and learning at all schools and all levels. And to me, this is a serious, serious breach.
And in your opinion, did Mr. Foley's activity result in a negative impact at the high school?
I believe it did.
Would that extend to both the staff and the students?
The email was sent to the staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scungio.
Mr. McAtee?
Good evening, Dr. Thornton. Doctor, a few moments ago, you characterized the November 25th action as a paid administrative leave and not suspension. Is that correct?
Paid administrative leave, correct.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor? All right. Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
He's got a promotion.
You familiar with that document, Dr. Thornton?
I am.
Did you write that document?
I did.
What day did you write it?
November 25th, 2009.
Would you read aloud for me the underlined passage, please?
Therefore, effective immediately until further notice, I am suspending you with pay from your position as principal of North Kingston High School during this suspension.
So on November 25th, there was a suspension.
That's what the letter says.
And on February 9th, it's a paid administrative leave.
Is that a question?
Yes, it is. Today, it's a paid administrative leave? Or is it a suspension?
To me, I think we're talking semantics in my mind in terms of the individual is paid, and it is a personnel matter, but he's paid.
So is it a suspension or administrative leave?
Objection as the answer.
Well, I still don't know the answer.
He gave his answer. Committee can do with that as it does.
Come on.
I believe the question has been answered by Dr. Foley, and I'm sorry, Dr. Thornton. The next question.
Point of order. Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Folks, one time, this is a public meeting, okay? This meeting is open to the public, but this is a disciplinary hearing. Please, do not disrupt the hearing, please. I'm asking you respectfully. Let us finish the hearing. There's no public comment. Please continue.
Larry, I do have a question if it's appropriate to ask at this time.
Hang on, Mr. Roth. Go ahead.
I'm confused. I have a question over the characterization of this as being a suspension or an administrative leave. I would like to understand the superintendent's clarification on what the difference is. And just because I'm not sure how to address the official of the meeting tonight, but he has stated for the record that we are going to consider this an administrative leave. I highlighted this when I saw this too. It says suspension, so I'd like to understand that distinction, and I haven't heard that yet. So, please.
I have an objection, Mr. Chairman. The chair and legal counsel has already ruled that he's asked and answered the question. He indicated for the record that in his mind it's a question of semantics. That's his answer. If certain parties like it or don't like it, that's fine. They could do with the response, but that's the evidence. The question has, in fact, been answered. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. McAtee?
Dr. Thornton, taking you back to November 25th now, when did you discover that Mr. Foley had sent out the email?
That morning at approximately 7:45.
Okay. And you received a complaint? Is that correct? Is
I
that
did.
how you? How many teachers teach at North Kingstown High School?
Over 100.
And do you unilaterally suspend based upon the complaint of one teacher on the same day that it's made?
What's your objection, Mr. Scanzi?
It's a hypothetical question not based on any facts and evidence or facts that he intends to prove.
I'll rephrase the question. Have you ever, before today, suspended or administrative leave, whatever the semantics are, based upon one email from a teacher,
To the high school principal.
other than the high school principal?
One email. No, I have not. I'm sorry. No. I have not suspended based on one email.
On that day, did you contact Mr. Foley regarding the email?
On the 25th,
Yes.
he reported to my office later that morning at approximately 11:30 a.m.
You called him there, though.
Yes,
And did you offer him a chance to explain it?
I did.
And did you ask him whether he intended to violate the earlier directive, the October 30th directive?
I asked him if he did send the email. Then, after his first response, where he said he didn't mean to send it, I reiterated, did he send it, and outlined who was on the email, the NKHS, the CC group, and I did speak to the earlier correspondence we had on record on October 30th.
Did you ask him whether he had intended the email to disrupt the operation of the school?
I did not ask that question.
Now, you didn't conduct any investigation into this email prior to this, did you?
I did not.
In fact, you had already had the letter, the November 25th letter that I just showed you, drafted when Mr. Foley came to your office, didn't you?
I did.
And at some point that day, Mr. Foley was removed from the high school, correct?
He was not removed from the high school. After our very brief meeting, I directed Mr. Foley to give his keys to Mr. Draper. He did so and left on his own and exited.
Did you ask any other teachers how they felt about the email that Mr. Foley sent?
At what point?
I'm sorry, on November 25th, before you issued your order?
I did.
You did. Any students?
No. The email was not sent to students.
But you didn't conduct any investigation to see if the students were disrupted by the email?
I did not conduct an investigation of the students.
Just have a few questions about the email system at the school. What is the purpose of it? What is it intended, the intended purpose of the email system?
To communicate school business.
And the principal is the top administrator assigned to each school, correct?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, the principal is the administrator assigned to, the top administrator assigned to each school, correct?
Correct.
And the principal is important to the educational mission, isn't he?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
To make a change of principal, I'm sorry, I'll move this closer. To make a change of principal, thank you. To make a change of principal is an important factor as far as the educational mission, correct?
Yes.
So taking action against a principal in the future of the principal is part of the educational mission, isn't it?
It is.
And it is relevant to education and learning, is it not?
Absolutely.
So would you say that faculty and staff need to be aware of such dramatic change that could be coming down the road as the change of the principal?
They were aware that following Monday morning.
That was in, I'm sorry, that was in response to putting Mr. Foley on suspension, though, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That meeting with the staff was not planned prior to putting Mr. Foley on suspension on November 25th, correct?
Correct.
So you had made no plans to talk to the faculty and staff at that point about the action taken by the school committee on November 24th, correct?
Following the meeting with Mr. Foley when he did leave the school campus, my next step was to send out a Connect Ed message to the community and also an email to the high school faculty. Following that, I secured Mr. Dupree on that weekend of Thanksgiving to be the interim, and I spoke to the high school faculty in an emergency meeting on that Monday morning.
Now, how long have you been the superintendent of schools here in North Kingstown?
I've been superintendent. It'll be coming up on 1 year as superintendent. Prior to that, I was the interim going back to that previous July.
Mr. Foley isn't the only person who's ever used the school email system for personal issues, is he?
I have no knowledge of all people. I have knowledge of what I receive. He's the only administrator I have knowledge of using a distribution list for his own personnel matter.
So he's the first person you've ever suspended on a first offense for violating in the email policy.
Yes.
In fact, to your knowledge, has anyone ever been suspended either before you or prior to this time? Has anybody in North Kingstown ever been suspended for sending a personal email message on the listserv?
I can't speak to before my time. I can only speak to my tenure. And in my tenure, no.
Have you ever taken anyone's email privileges away from them as a punishment for using the email system?
I have not.
So is it fair to say that this is the only action you've ever taken in regards to personal messages on the email system?
Yes.
Now, this isn't the first time you've come before this school committee recommending a suspension for Mr. Foley, is it?
I came before the committee on November 21st for a non-renewal hearing.
Prior to that, and I am referring here.
I'm sorry. Earlier in the fall, we did have a school committee meeting regarding a suspension issue in, I don't know, about early September.
And what was your recommendation at that time?
It was a 5-day suspension.
And the school committee didn't follow your recommendation at that time, did they?
That is correct.
But it's your recommendation today that you be suspended 30 days for sending an email, correct?
My recommendation stems from more than sending an email. It's for creating a learning environment that, actually, if I could, creating an environment that is not conducive to teaching and learning. It's the email. It's the tenor of the high school. It's focused on his personnel matter and not teaching and learning.
You're recommending 30 days on top of the 2 months he's already been out of school. Is that correct?
30 days, correct.
When you recommend suspending someone, how do you determine the length of time that you make in your recommendation?
I don't take any suspension lightly. To me, the insubordination I have characterized in my testimony, I find extremely serious. And to me, 30 days seemed like a very appropriate time.
Do you base it on any similar offenses?
In this matter, in terms of case law in Rhode Island, there are all kinds of prior cases. I think when I look at this, I look at what has happened in Rhode Island and what seems appropriate in my opinion.
Okay, can you name some?
I don't recall the citations. We have cases in Cumberland, Central Falls. I don't recall the citations. Forgive me for not having the citations.
Did you speak to anyone else, any of your fellow superintendents, before you issued this recommendation?
Objection. As to relevance?
Mr. McAtee, relevance?
Trying to determine what he based the 30 days on.
Why don't you ask him?
I did.
I think he's answered that question.
For any offense, have you ever suspended anyone for 30 days without pay?
I believe I have. Actually, no, 2 weeks. Forgive me.
2 weeks.
I have a prior instance in the first year. We had a suspension not as long as this one.
Okay.
And actually, in this case, that was paid.
That was paid. Mm-hmm. So what's the longest unpaid suspension that you've ever recommended?
This is the longest suspension I recommended for being unpaid.
Other than this, what is the second longest?
This is the one and only.
This is the only time you've ever recommended a suspension?
As superintendent for my first year, this is it.
Other than the 5-day suspension you already testified.
Correct.
I have a few questions about the October 30th directive, Dr. Thornton. And as far as the bumper stickers that you testified to, Mr. Foley didn't create these bumper stickers, did he?
I don't believe he did.
He didn't encourage others to create these bumper stickers on his behalf, did he?
I don't know.
Did you ever hear him?
Hear him?
Did you ever hear him encouraging or making any
I
reference?
did not.
Mr. Foley, in fact, he didn't sanction these bumper stickers to be placed around the school, did he?
I don't know that.
Okay. In fact, Mr. Foley directed school staff to remove the bumper stickers from the walls the day you learned of them, didn't he?
I don't know that.
But you never attempted to investigate that.
I did when I walked the school grounds, school campus.
But you
that
never-
evening.
But you never attempted to investigate who made the bumper stickers?
I did actually receive a phone call on the bumper stickers.
And can you tell the committee what the substance of that phone call was?
Sure. A parent called to relate that they had created them.
Did they mention whether Mr. Foley had any involvement in creating the bumper stickers?
They related that he did not.
Did they mention that he paid for the bumper stickers?
They didn't speak to any name.
Did they? In fact, you never personally saw Mr. Foley distribute the bumper stickers?
I did not.
Who did? I'm sorry, that wasn't, I'll rephrase the question. Did you? You never actually saw anyone distribute the bumper stickers yourself, did you?
I did not.
Now, to your October 30th, still on your October 30th directive, that directive was for Mr. Foley not to discuss his own personal matter on school time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What time was the email sent?
6:45 a.m.
What time does school start?
School starts after that. However, when you send an email from a principal to your faculty, you have now essentially created a situation where every faculty member, during the course of their business day at some point, will have to open the email. You've in fact created a situation where the email will be read during school time and probably after school time.
As an administrator, are you familiar with the concept of progressive discipline?
I am.
You would agree that there's a difference between a minor violation and a major violation. Is that correct?
I would agree with that.
And a discipline administered should be proportional to the alleged violation.
I would agree with that.
And that in general, a suspension is a rather severe punishment, isn't it?
I would agree.
And you would agree that there are disciplinary measures at your disposal that are less severe than a suspension, wouldn't you?
Yes, an example of that would be my October 30th letter.
And when deciding what type of punishment to administer, you take account the employment history of the individual, don't you?
Yes.
You look at how long he's worked in the district.
Yes.
Look at how long he's been in his particular job.
Yes.
And Mr. Foley's been in the district for 20 years, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And he's been principal of North Kingstown High School for 18.
17, 18, yes.
Now, you never specifically warned Mr. Foley about the use of the email system, did you?
I want Mr. Foley in my third paragraph to cease and desist.
I'm sorry, which document are you referring to?
October 30th, which I'm holding. I warned him, I'm directing you to cease and desist any further involvement of students or staff on your behalf. I am also directing you to concentrate your efforts.
Okay, Dr. Thorne, is there... He's not answering the question. He's reading another paragraph.
It may be that counsel doesn't like the response. The witness is entitled to respond.
Please finish answering the question, Dr. Thornton.
I'm also directing you to concentrate your efforts as the educational leader of North Kingstown High School and spend your time improving teaching and learning that takes place in your building. Your personal activities are to be done on your own time and off school grounds.
Could I have a moment, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Dr. Thornton, you also mentioned some advertisements that you allege Mr. Foley placed in the teacher mailboxes?
No, what I'm saying is the first, I believe the first exhibit, this exhibit.
Yep. That was Exhibit 1,
Are there-
Mr. Scungio? Okay. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with any other instances where people place any advertisements or personal correspondences in the teacher mailboxes?
I'm not familiar with any other circumstance where an administrator placed correspondence on his or her own personal matter in teacher mailboxes.
But how about any personal matter?
Any personal matter. I mean, I guess
Anything not, I'm sorry, I'll clarify the question. Anything not related to the education of the students at North Kingstown High School? The relevance is that we were told before that the mailboxes are for the educational purpose of the school.
Mr. Foley can answer that question. I'm sorry, Dr. Thornton.
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
Sure. Are you familiar with any other correspondences placed in teacher mailboxes that did not relate to the educational mission or business of North Kingstown High School?
I'm not familiar, no.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Scungio? Mr. Scungio?
I just have a few follow-up questions. You were asked on cross-examination about a recommendation for a 5-day suspension that was made by you.
I was.
And at least to my understanding, it was made to be seen that your request was overruled. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. In fact, didn't the school committee ask for the superintendent's resignation in response to the 5-day, your request for a 5-day suspension?
They asked for the principal's resignation.
Yes. Did I say that?
They did.
Superintendent.
Superintendent, I apologize. Did they also express a lack of confidence in the high school principal?
They did.
And that was done publicly, is that correct?
It was.
Mr. Chairman, I checked again. Again, we're going into areas not relevant to the disciplinary matter before us.
See, the problem, Mr. Chair, is when the door is opened, council is allowed to inquire into that area to the extent it was brought up in cross-examination. So to the extent that my brother raised it to show that Mr. Thornton would make a recommendation for discipline that this school committee wouldn't follow through on is certainly appropriate for me to clarify before the committee now.
The issue was raised, Mr. Chairman, as far as this disproportionate response and the difference between the response to that action and the response to this action. You made no representation whatsoever about Mr. Foley's competence as an administrator. That is not an issue.
Mr. Scungio, are we going further down this road, or have you put everything on the record you wanted?
That's all I have on that point.
Next question.
Was the response allowed?
The response was allowed.
Thank you. In your professional opinion, do you believe that a 30-day paid suspension, in light of the fact that you had previously given a correspondence to an employee indicating he should not engage in certain activity, would be a sufficient amount of time for him to learn the lesson in terms of progressive discipline, not to repeat that activity?
I do.
In your professional opinion, do you believe that insubordination is a serious act?
I believe it's an extremely serious act.
There's some confusion with respect to the term personal and personnel. When Mr. McEntee asked you questions about the use of the email system or the mailbox system, very often he used the word personal. Is that correct? So
believe so.
perhaps a personal advertisement placed in an email box. Is that correct?
Yes.
To your knowledge, has any employee in this district used either the school email system or the mailbox for teachers or staff to draw in or to discuss a personnel matter that involved that individual?
No.
Is that something that you would countenance under any set of circumstances?
Yes.
Did you hear my question?
Say it again?
Is that activity something that you would countenance under any set of circumstances?
I would not. I don't condone that at any point.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Mr. McAtee, any recourse? Thank you. Mr. Scunzio?
We have no further witnesses.
Mr. Chairman?
Yep. Mr. You want Mr. Thornton back in his chair? Mr. Thornton, before, Dr. Thornton, before we begin with Mr. Foley, I believe there might be a question or two from the committee. Would you please retake the stand? Committee members.
Thank you. At this time, if any committee members have any questions for Dr. Thornton, now would be an opportunity. Mr. Roth?
It's a couple clarifying questions. So I want to get back to the notion of the definition of suspension, administrative leave. You're saying it's semantics, so by that answer, you're giving up the definition. Suspension, administrative leave, it's all one and the same. With all due respect, it hasn't been answered. I'd like to get an understanding of what that definition is, so I'm hoping that we're being allowed the latitude to ask the question.
No disrespect intended, but he said in his mind it's a matter of semantics.
What does he mean by semantics?
The question has been answered. If you don't like the answer, you can disregard the answer, but he has in fact answered the question, and he's provided the information to the
I'll
committee.
rephrase my question then. What do you mean by semantics?
What I mean is, in this matter, the principal was in a paid status. To me, whether you're talking about the suspension or the paid leave, it was semantics.
It's one and the same. Okay.
I stand by what I said.
Okay. Prior to the events of the 25th, I see in different exhibits here, especially October 30th. I just want to understand if I get the timeline of events right. In the exhibit dated October 30, we've acknowledged to Mr. Foley that you've understood about the bumper stickers at that point, correct?
Yes.
And we've also talked about advocacy on his own behalf, that type of thing, and you've also offered a directive to cease and desist any further involvement. And that was dated 10/30.
That's what the letter says.
Okay. On November 24th, this committee convened to discuss the issue of non-renewal. These events, this letter, came to light and was understood completely prior to the night of the 24th, correct?
Correct. October 30th letter.
Right.
And 11/24 non-renewal meeting.
And in the discussion of non-renewal on the night of the 24th, is it safe to say that there was a consensus on the committee, and based on your recommendation, that the issue of non-renewal did not equate to Mr. Foley's performance, or that there was no question on the night of the 24th, even in regard to things that have happened and noted on the 30th, that he would not be allowed to complete his contract or to complete his work? There was no indication given the night of the 24th that something like this would happen. In fact, the minutes reflect that there was a consensus that while the renewal might not happen, certainly that Mr. Foley would be allowed to complete his contract, right? Objection. Object to what?
Mr. Roth, please.
He doesn't have to like the question or the answer, but he's going to work both ways, Mr. Scundio. You don't have to like the question or the answer, but that's a fair question.
Sure. Just Mr. Jones. Mr. Scunzio, you've placed an objection on this record.
Yes, sir.
What's your objection?
I have several.
Go.
First, there's testimony as opposed to questions, so I ask that that be stricken from the record. Second, with respect to the one of 5 questions that was put to the witness at the same time, and there should only be one, The witness was repeatedly asked to determine what was in the minds of the committee, which is completely inappropriate. Third, with respect to the minutes speak for themselves, which are public records, which the committee has. So I have an objection to all 5 questions that were put to Mr. Thornton.
Mr. Roth, were the minutes of the meetings public sessions?
Yes,
They were done on the 24th, am I correct?
correct.
And the decisions of the school committee were part and parcel of those minutes?
Correct.
Okay.
Those minutes reflect decision-making and recommendations that reflect a total body of work that also is inclusive of the events of all of this, including the letter of the 30th, which is part and parcel to the discussion of the suspension. So what I'm driving at, maybe we can talk about it, because I don't want to get buried in minutiae here and parliamentary procedure. What I'm driving at is on the night of the 24th, all of these things had happened, and there was not a notion of a suspension. The next morning, we have a man out on suspension on a semantic definition of it, and I want to know what changed. And if that email solely sent on the 25th triggered that, then I need to understand if Dr. Thornton believes if there was anything else leading up to it. That's what I'm saying. I mean, we drew a conclusion on the 24th, and on the 25th, this went a much different direction. And I'd like to understand if I'm mischaracterizing or not understanding that, because the recommendations on the 24th were inclusive of this thinking, correct, from the note of the 30th?
I think I have the question. On the 24th, we were talking about non-renewal, and that was the process on 11/24 that evening. As I testified, the following morning, I was quite stunned to see this email, which to me was insubordination from the October 30th letter. You are correct. We had the pathway of non-renewal that evening. The next morning, to my disbelief, we were not talking about insubordination. 2 different conversations.
I think that answers your question, Mr. Roth.
More or less. I have a couple of follow-ups. Do you want to wait or do you want to continue?
No, I would like to get them done now.
Okay. So, Dr. Thornton, we've said this is the first lengthy suspension you've issued.
Yes.
Can you draw a distinction for me between you acting unilaterally to suspend and in other situations where issues have come before the board, maybe we don't discuss completely issues of it, but things that we do know about where you did not act to suspend either an employee, a teacher, et cetera, in a situation where potentially learning environment or the learning potential of a child's been impacted. So what's the difference between acting unilaterally and waiting in other cases?
Mr. Roth, that question, as far as, the bounds of this particular hearing are, it seems to me, is outside of the bounds of this hearing.
That's
I
how I would
understand
draw it.
I understand where you're trying to go, but I think the questions that have been asked of the superintendent by both sides state his position rather clearly on the record. And I understand that your question is trying to delve further into why he did a particular thing in a particular way. That's for the deliberations of the committee.
That's fine. I agree with that. I'll withdraw the question. So the other question I'd have is on the notion of the bumper stickers. You don't know that Mr. Foley didn't create the bumper sticker, right?
I think I testified to this.
Yes.
Did you ask Mr. Foley directly whether he created the bumper sticker?
I did not.
Did you ask Mr. Foley directly whether he put up the bumper sticker?
I did not.
Yet this was a key component of the decision to suspend, right? I mean, we've noted this a couple of times that the impact of having that sticker in the school building was an impact.
Mike?
Asked and answered.
No, I have a different objection. Sorry, I'm doing my job, Doug. Though due respect, that was not the testimony that was given by this witness. The testimony that was given by this witness is that gave rise to the notice, which was comprised in that letter. The notice set out the anticipation of how he expected his administrator to act. We moved from that point to the email. The sending of the email became what, in our view, is the insubordination. That's the reason for the discipline. The correspondence was sent out preliminarily to let the employee know that this activity was inappropriate and that it should not be repeated. It's the violation of that correspondence that gave rise to this proceeding today. It's not the reason why he's asking for the suspension. It's an indicia of the fact that activity is being repeated, which is similar in nature, which demonstrates that it's willful activity, if you will. But there was never any testimony or an assertion on the part of the witness at any point that Mr. Foley grabbed the bumper stickers and put them up on the wall.
It just seems he's being held responsible for something he didn't initiate, didn't do, and attempted to fix at a decent rate. Well, I don't know. That's what I'm trying to understand. Is it just appears that way to me. So.
I understand. The testimony that the witness gave actually was that he viewed the school at 7 o'clock that night, and there were dozens of stickers still up to be taken down. Okay. So from that, he drew an inference.
Okay, just a couple of quick other questions. Dr. Thornton, to your knowledge, is there a policy specifically prohibiting a teacher, an administrator, from typing a letter, using the mailboxes, and distributing it to teachers? Is there an NKSD policy that exists?
Is there a policy that says adults can't type letters and use the email?
No, I'm not talking about email. We talked about the distribution of a letter to emails to teachers' mailboxes. Did a physical distribution of that happen?
I'm not sure I know where you're going.
Was there a printing or a physical distribution of the notification to teachers?
Yes.
Is there any prohibition anywhere in NKSD policy that suggests they can't do it that you know of?
I do not know of a policy that speaks to administrators relating their personnel matters to teachers. No, I do not.
Okay. That's all I've got for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Any other members have any questions for Dr. Thornton? I'll work my way down the table if that's okay. Mr. Welch, did you have any at this time? I can certainly come back to you if you'd like me to.
Come back.
Okay. Mrs. Abizano? Mrs. Page?
I have one.
Sure.
Dr. Thornton, were you employed at our school district when we received emails from teachers complaining about principals?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Were you employed at our school district when we received emails from teachers complaining about a principal?
A principal?
I don't want to say which principal.
I don't know.
Okay.
Any other questions? Mrs. Abizano?
Dr. Thornton, when employees arrive at school, do you consider the employees to be bound by the rules and regulations of the district at that time or when the school day begins? How does that work?
When they arrive at school.
That's all. Thank you.
Mrs. Brunel? Anyone else for Dr. Thornton at this time? Mr. Welch?
Dr. Thornton, would you have any problems being held to the same standard that you have conveyed on or asking us to approve on Principal Foley?
No.
Anyone else? Anything else for Dr. Thornton at this time? Mr. McIntyre, I presume, do you have a witness to call? Mr. McIntyre, I apologize to interrupt 1 minute. We have a few committee members that are asking for a quick 2-minute recess at this time, so we're going to take a quick 2-minute recess.
Doctor, that's on.
Mr. Foley needs to be sworn in.
Didn't work. It's supposed to be smarter, right?
You're very hasty.
Smelling.
Yeah, you want me to say it? You need to swear, Mr. Foley.
Okay. Thank you. We are now back in session.
Testing.
Please proceed.
I do. Gerald K. Foley.
Mr. McAtee.
Good evening, Mr. Good evening, Mr. Foley. Mr. Foley, how long have you been principal at North Kingstown High School?
This is my 18th year.
And how long have you worked in the district?
It's my 21st year.
Now, I'll take you back to November 25th, if I could. Did you send an email that day on the school listserv system?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you say in that email?
I described to my faculty what had happened the night before at the school committee meeting, and I wanted them to know that I was not being rehired for another year, that I would be finishing my principalship on June 30th, 2010, and I encouraged them to continue with the teaching and learning that they need to do every single day.
And for what purpose did you send that email?
I sent it out for information for my faculty. I thought it would be very important for them to learn about that particular meeting, and especially the fact that I would only be there until June the 30th.
Did you ask them in that email to do anything on your behalf?
I did not.
Did you ask them to contact anyone on your behalf?
I did not.
Was it your aim to distract teachers and staff from executing their job that day?
It was not.
Is it your belief that they were distracted from their job that day?
It's my belief that they were not.
Okay. Was your motivation in any way to disrupt the school day?
No, it was not.
And what time of day did you send that email out?
Approximately 6:45 in the morning.
Were you trying to garner any support by doing that?
No.
Do you recall having a meeting with Dr. Thornton on that day?
Yes.
Did Dr. Thornton give you any opportunity to explain your motivation for sending that out?
He asked me if I had sent the email. He showed me the email on his computer because I wasn't quite sure which one he was talking about. I sent out several emails that morning to different factions and also to the faculty because it was the day before Thanksgiving. He asked me why I sent it out. I told him for information purposes. I wanted my faculty to know what had happened. He told me that that was against the email policy, that he had warned me about that in the past in October. I disagreed with that and said he had not warned me about that in October. And he said because I violated the policy, he was suspending me without pay. He had a letter ready to go for me in a sealed envelope, which he gave me. He asked for my keys, which I turned in. I asked him if the suspension would be over so that I could come back to school on Monday. This was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the long weekend. He said no, but that he would be in touch with me.
Did he ever get back in touch with you?
He did not until I sent a letter through my lawyer to him in December, finally asking for a hearing or a meeting to be reinstated.
Now, did you tell Dr. Thornton at any point that you didn't mean to send out that email?
I don't remember saying that, no. I had my intention that morning when I came to school early, and I had actually done the email at home and then just transcribed it onto the computer system at school, was to get the information out to the faculty as quickly as possible. They could have it before school time, or whenever they saw it. The day before Thanksgiving, they might not even look at it because of the nature of that day in school. But eventually they would get it, and they would understand the information I wanted them to have. I periodically will send the faculty information on many matters. It helps, of course, by doing that way, it cuts down the number of meetings necessary to have with the faculty on a whole bunch of issues related to education.
Do you feel it was important for them to know the events that happened at the school committee the night before?
Certainly.
Why is that?
Well, it's part of our process to work together collaboratively and cooperatively as an educational community. I've been in charge of that community for quite a while. If there was going to be a change coming up in the near future, I thought it was very important that they needed to know that.
Now, in regard to the directive issued on October 30th, do you remember receiving that directive from Dr. Thornton?
I do.
And what did you take that directive to mean?
I took it to mean that he was concerned, first and foremost, that he had been in the building, I think probably just before that, and saw some bumper stickers that were out there, and he connoted that to mean that I was involved with those bumper stickers trying to plead my cause or my case, and also that I had put a letter in teachers' mailboxes on my own accord, done on my own stationery, done at home, which I put in the mailboxes of teachers at about that particular time, just stating my case. I did talk to him about the bumper stickers once I received his letter, letting him know that the bumper stickers had been produced by two of our students, that I had found out they had produced them, and they had been handed out to fellow students for no fee or no sum of money, just to state the case that they are supporting me. I had talked to their father about this, and he said that he had the bumper stickers made at his work, that he had paid for them, that he had supported his kids in their efforts to pass them out. Certainly they should have been placed all over the building. When I heard that that had happened, I told the custodial staff that wherever they found it, to make sure that they take it down. They were the kind of stickers that could be taken off easily rather than take a long time to be taken down, but in no way did we want that to happen. And I asked the parent if he would call Dr. Thornton on the issue. He said he did. He called me back and said he had talked to Dr. Thornton and clarified that matter with him.
Did you have anything at all to do with the bumper stickers?
I did not.
Mr. Foley, do you have any problem with Dr. Thornton's directive that you not have conversations about your personal situation during school hours?
I do not.
And when you sent out that email on November 25th, did you think that you were violating the earlier directive?
I did not, or else I never would have done it.
In your 20 years in the district, has anyone ever violated the school's email policy by using it for personal reasons?
Yes.
And can you give us some examples of instances where that's happened?
Yeah, they're all handled internally. Staff members or support staff members might solicit from other staff members 2 tickets to a play coming up, which they can't use. Does anybody like to buy them? Selling a sofa that's left over from when their kids were going off to college, things like that. I have to call it to the attention of staff members when they do that, that that's not the use of the email system, not for that reason, and that they have to cease and desist in doing that, or else have to take further action against them. And it's usually been cleared up in that fashion so that no further action is necessary.
Are you aware of anyone in North Kingstown who's ever been suspended for 30 days for this matter, for misusing the email system?
I am not.
Are you familiar with anyone in North Kingstown who's ever been suspended at all for violating the email policy for any suspension for any duration?
I am not.
Are you familiar with what your colleagues around the state do when school email policies have been violated?
The objection. Mr. McAtee?
There's no evidence that anyone in North Kingstown has ever been suspended. I'm trying to establish that it's never happened in the state of Rhode Island, to the best of our knowledge.
I'll allow it. You can ask him that on cross.
The matter has come up on occasion at principal meetings, conferences, and the like about whether or not people have done something like this. I do not know, other than the cases I'm talking about, talking to fellow principals about some of the staff and minor issues, not using the email system properly. I know of no other system, and again, I'm one of the senior members of the principals committee now and at principalship in state. I know of no other district that this has happened.
Have you ever heard of anyone being placed on administrative leave for this?
For this, no, I have not.
Have you ever heard of a superintendent recommending that someone be suspended for this?
I have not.
Have you ever heard of someone being terminated for this? I'm trying to establish the rather minor infraction that Mr. Foley is being suspended for, or being recommended to be suspended.
Mr. Mr. McAtee, is that stipulation fine?
That is fine.
Okay.
Mr. Foley, what was the last day you served as principal of North Kingstown High School?
It was Wednesday, November 25th, the day before Thanksgiving.
Until tonight, have you received any hearing on this matter?
I have not. I've received no information from central administration about this matter.
Mr. Foley, there's no question on the floor. You answered the question.
Has anyone from central administration contacted you on this matter?
No, not until I put a letter in to central administration requesting reinstatement.
And how did Dr. Thornton communicate to you his intention to recommend that you be suspended for 30 days?
In the letter he sent me in return for my request to have a hearing, he stated that a meeting would be set up, a hearing would be set up on this date, February 9th, and that he would recommend at that time a 30-day suspension without pay on top of the nearly over 2 months I've already been out of school on what I thought was a suspension with pay, which maybe has been clarified tonight, still not in my mind, but for an extra month. I would be suspended for an extra month in regards to this particular hearing tonight.
When did you first request a hearing on this matter?
In late December.
Mr. Foley, have you ever in any venue asked members of the faculty to do anything on your behalf as far as the issue of renewal or non-renewal of your contract?
I have not.
Have you ever involved any students in that matter?
I have not.
Okay. I have nothing further.
Good evening, Mr. Foley.
Good evening.
Is it your testimony that the reason why we have a hearing tonight is because you sent a correspondence to the superintendent asking for one?
That is correct.
Did you know that your attorney in my office had been discussing settlement, and that your attorney, Mr. Robinson, proposed that we stand down and not have the hearing until we finish those discussions?
I knew that there was some kind of discussions going on, yes.
So that, in fact, was the reason for the delay, wasn't it?
I think to a certain extent that is true.
To every extent, that was true. Isn't that correct?
On November 25th, I was suspended. I never heard anything at all until I put a letter out saying, could I please have a hearing? It was not my intention to stay home and collect pay for doing nothing. I wanted to come back to work.
But in fact, your attorney was in continuous conversations with my office on your behalf. Isn't that correct?
I can't speak exactly for that. He's not here tonight, so
But you knew those conversations were ongoing, didn't you?
some conversations were happening, yes.
And you also knew that both sides agreed that we wouldn't hold the hearing till we tried to resolve our issues.
I did not know that, no.
Your attorney never informed you of that?
No.
Okay. Is it your testimony that the email of November 25th, 2009, which was penned by you and sent out to your whole staff, was simply to give your staff information about what happened at the hearing?
That's correct.
It wasn't to influence them in any way?
No, my staff has never been involved in these particular matters that I've had before me with either the superintendent or the school committee.
So the matter was purely informational?
It was.
So it was informational when you referred to the school committee as bullies, is that correct?
It was informational, yes.
It was informational when you said "they," which I assume you mean either the school committee or somebody who works for the school district, shut down your Facebook. Or a
Again-
student's Facebook.
Again, it was informational.
That was informational. It was informational when you told the staff that your rights were repeatedly violated. Is that correct?
That is informational.
And it's informational when you told your staff that you have sued the school committee and the superintendent. Is that correct?
That was already public knowledge.
Or was that part of the information you wished them to have?
Yes.
Okay. It was informational when you thanked the faculty in the high school for stepping up on your behalf. Is that correct?
That entire email was informational.
Would you answer my specific question, please, sir?
Yes.
Could you answer my question? That was informational?
Yes.
Okay. Which staff in particular from this high school were you thanking for showing up at the non-renewal hearing?
I was thanking all of the staff for their support towards me.
Did any of your staff show up to support you at the non-renewal hearing?
I don't remember how many were here.
There were none here, Mr. Foley.
Well, again, I don't remember how many were here.
That's not true.
So you can't recall anyone?
I recall seeing some people here, yes.
Who?
You're asking me how many, I'm not sure.
What members of your high school staff were here in support of you that night?
Well, no one was speaking that particular night in my support, and I understood why. They were impartial to the proceedings. They were focused on teaching and learning, and that these were my issues I had with the school committee and with the superintendent.
Now, what would you expect the high school staff to have with this informational email, such as you calling the school committee individuals bullies?
What would I expect?
What would you expect them to do with that information?
Nothing.
What would you expect them to do with the information that you were complaining that your rights were violated?
Nothing. It was just information. That was my own issue.
And what would you expect them to do with the information that you're suing the school committee and the superintendent of schools?
Well, that was public knowledge, but I would expect them to do nothing with that information except teach and learn, which they do quite well.
Now, you testified before that you had several instances of teachers who used emails for private purposes, and you instructed them that they were not to use that system for private purposes?
Yes.
Is it your testimony that this email was sent out for other than private purposes?
Which email is that?
The one dated November 25th, 2009?
It was sent out for information purposes.
About your personnel matter?
About my non-renewal.
In which way does this email of November 25th, 2009 enhance teaching and learning and focus staff to better teach the students in the classroom?
It informs them that their basic job should not be at all changed, and their focus should remain on teaching and learning, regardless of the fact if I am their principal or somebody else is.
Could you point out in your correspondence where you said that, Mr. Foley? I'd like to hand this to you.
What was the question again?
Could I have the question repeated, please?
Can you do that one more time, please? But can you,
I think you need to go back further in the record. Would you go back to Mr. Foley's prior answer, please? And the answer?
I'm looking at the email right now.
Could I hear the question repeated back? I had trouble hearing the stenographer.
Sure. Would you repeat that question again, that section again, for the school committee member? Mr. Roth? Need a microphone?
The question was, in which way does this email of November 25, 2009 enhance teaching and learning and focus staff to better teach the students in the classroom?
Okay.
Answer, it informs them that their basic job should not be at all changed and the focus should remain on teaching and learning regardless of the fact if I am their principal or somebody else's. Then the following question, could you point out in your correspondence where you said that, Mr. Foley? I would like to hand this to you.
Thank you.
It'd be found in the first paragraph of my email to them, not in the exact way that you mentioned, but in the information piece that by a 4-3 vote I was not going to be renewed. But of course, we would continue to do our work collectively together.
So you would infer that from telling the staff that the school committee voted not to renew you, followed by the sentences, round one is over, round two begins today. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Now, you testified that you recalled receiving a correspondence of October 30th, 2009 from the superintendent of schools, in which he said, therefore, I am directing you to cease and desist any further involvement of students and staff on your behalf. I'm also directing you to concentrate your efforts as the educational leader of the North Kingstown High School and spend your time improving teaching and learning that takes place in your building. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And you sit here tonight and you tell the committee that you do not believe that this correspondence of November 25th, 2009 conflicts with that directive from your superintendent. Is that correct?
That is correct.
As you sit here tonight, then, you still feel that your correspondence was perfectly appropriate. Is that correct?
That is correct. I thought it was the information needed for my faculty.
Now, you indicated in your testimony, if I got it correct, that the day after the non-renewal meeting before the school committee, that you came to work early and you wanted to get this informational email out as soon as possible. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you did not indicate to the superintendent that you sent it out by mistake.
I don't remember doing that, no.
Is it a case you not remember, or are you certain that you did not say that?
Well, the conversation was a very quick one and a very brief one we had at his office. He asked if I had sent the communique. I said I had. He asked why, and I said for information's sake. He said it violated the policy. I said I don't think it did. And basically he gave me a letter and told me that I would be suspended indefinitely and to turn my keys in, which I did.
So you feel relatively certain that you didn't make the statement that you sent the email out by mistake?
Correct.
Are you as certain about that as the rest of your testimony today?
Yes.
As you sit here tonight and you heard the superintendent testify, do you still believe that your actions were not insubordinate?
I do. I would not do an insubordinate act at any time. I have not done so in 21 years here. I felt my act was just to inform my faculty on what was happening.
Thank you, Mr. Foley.
Mr. McAtee.
Very briefly. Mr. Foley, you were asked about the Facebook page that was created. Do you recall what that Facebook page was?
I never saw the Facebook page. I was told that members of our student body had formed a Facebook page in the fall in support of me. I eventually was told by students that that Facebook page was taken down.
Do you know who took it down?
I do not know. I do know, however, that the student in question who started the page told me that she had not taken the page down, so it had to be somebody else.
I'd like to draw your attention back to November 24th. To the best of your recollection, were there any teachers here, or were there any teachers present at the school committee meeting?
And again, I'm not quite sure of that because I was sitting facing the front. The place was pretty largely packed, and therefore I assume that some teachers might have been in attendance, but I do not know exactly who. I did not solicit or tell any teachers to come and support me on that particular night.
And why is that?
There was no need to. It was not their issue, it was my issues.
I have nothing further.
I have no further questions.
Thank you.
School committee.
I'll start at the end of the table and work my way down. If somebody would like to defer, I can certainly go back to them if that's the case. Mr. Welch?
Started this end last time.
I'll defer. Mr. Roth?
Thanks. I just have a couple questions, Larry, and then I may have follow-ups depending on where we go. Mr. Foley, pretty simply, knowing then what you know now about sending that email, if you came back to work, would you do something like that again?
No, never.
All right. Do you harbor any personal animus towards school committee members or the superintendent?
I do not.
Do you feel that that may in reverse be the case? Do you feel that there may be personal animus towards you?
I don't know.
He's already answered the question.
That's fine. I'll withdraw the question. Mr. Foley, is there anything stopping you from resuming your duties as principal besides the understanding we arrive here and our ability and the superintendent's ability to get beyond this to allow you to finish your contract?
There is nothing stopping me. I'm ready to work tomorrow if you so desire.
Okay. I have nothing further at this time, but I may have more.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Mrs. Held?
No.
Mrs. Avezzano?
No.
Mrs. Page?
I don't have any questions, Mr. Foley, but I did ask a question earlier of Dr. Thornton, and eventually I'd like to be able to re-ask that question. He was unable to recall what I was talking about, and I informed him privately as to what principle I was asking about. I know this isn't the time, but I'm just letting you know.
Okay. Mrs. Bruno?
Yes, I do have a question. In regards to the letter that you sent out in the email, under round 2 begins today, you state that I'm coming after them, and who are you referring to?
It means that it meant that I am seeking legal means against anyone, in this case, the school committee, in appealing my case.
And how does this relate to teaching and learning?
It's informational to my staff.
Information related to teaching and learning. In your opinion, is that information that relates to teaching and learning?
It's only information to say that I'm not going to be back after June the 30th.
So it's not about teaching and learning, it's about information?
It's about focusing in on what has to be done for the rest of the year.
Wasn't my question. Okay, you're saying that this is information, and my question is this information about teaching and learning?
I look upon it as that way, yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Brunel. I have a couple of quick questions for Mr. Foley. Good evening, Mr. Foley. A couple of quick questions in reference to the exhibits that have been entered as part of the record tonight, and also a couple of questions with regard to your testimony. Earlier, you testified that this letter, this email that you sent out, you felt that there was nothing wrong with it, that it was informational to your staff. And you testified that you didn't feel there was anything wrong with it, and as you just answered Mrs. Brunel's questions as well. But yet, Mr. Roth asked you, knowing what you know now, would you send this email again? And you said, no, never. But earlier you testified that you felt there was nothing wrong with the email that you sent. Those two are kind of contradictory of each other. I'd like an explanation of that.
If I had had any clear directive from central administration on the email policy and what to and not to do, I would have followed that policy as directed.
You are aware the district has a policy on the use of the network system and the email system?
I am, and I've upheld that policy for many, many years.
So you're aware of that policy, and your job description requires you to have full knowledge of all the district's policies, correct?
Correct.
And you say you're aware of that policy?
Yes.
And you don't believe the email that you sent violates that policy?
That's correct.
But yet Mr. Roth said, to do it all over again, would you send it? And you said, no, never.
Well, I have been sitting home twiddling my thumbs for over 2 months now because of an email. So certainly, even though I thought there was nothing wrong with the email, if I knew now then what I know now, you're asking me would I have not sent it? Of course I would not have sent it. Why would I want to sit home on the taxpayer's dollar doing nothing?
There was a question that was asked earlier, to your knowledge. Has anyone ever been suspended or whatnot for misuse of the network or misuse of the email system?
The email system.
And you answered not that you're aware of?
Correct.
You're not aware that an employee was terminated in this district just several years ago for misuse of the network system? You have no knowledge of that?
It wasn't one of my employees.
Okay. Continuing on, you testified earlier when you were asked that you've never solicited any students or parents to come out and support you. Is that your testimony, that you've never had any contact with parents or students and asked them to come out and support you tonight or any of the other nights that you've met with the school committee? That's what the question you answered earlier, that's the answer that you gave. That's your testimony?
That is correct. I have had parents contact me and students come up and ask me questions. And I've been truthful to them or whatever they're asking about. If you're asking me, did I tell anyone about this meeting tonight?
I'm asking you, have you had contact with students or parents and asked them to come out and support you tonight or the other nights when you had hearings in front of the school committee? That you were asked that question by legal counsel earlier and you testified, no, you have not. I'm asking you that question again.
Yes.
That's your answer? Is that
It's asked and answered.
Okay.
I think I've already answered it, but that's
Okay.
correct.
Thank you.
Did it to me.
I don't have any other questions. Is there any other questions or comments from committee members for Mr. Foley at this time? Mr. Roth?
A couple quick follow-ups. Mr. Foley, after the evening of the 24th, after the school committee meeting, and after the committee took its vote, and your understanding of this process up until that point, including the letters of the 30th and your communications with the superintendent, did you have any idea that you would not be allowed to finish your contract?
I did not.
And do you feel that there's anything standing in the way of you completing your contract now?
I do not.
Anything else, Mr. Roth?
Not at this time.
Mr. Welch?
You're amazing, Mr. Chairman. You know I'm not going to ask a question without looking at me. Thank you. Mr. Foley, the letter that's headed off, open letter to the North Kingstown community, is that the letter that was submitted into the teachers' mailboxes?
Yes.
This is an unsigned letter. It is your work?
It is.
How is this letter produced?
On my own computer at home, with copies made that I paid for at Kinko's.
You referred to sending a letter requesting a hearing. I don't see an exhibit on that. Does that letter not exist? Mr. Foley, while your attorney is looking for that letter, the same situation were to exist in the private sector. Do you have any idea what would have happened to an employee of position in this situation?
I do not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Anyone else?
Waiting for a letter?
Absolutely, thank you.
Counsel, is that being offered as an exhibit?
I will offer an exhibit, yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Scunzio, any objection? Have you seen the letter? Sure. Before you distribute it. Employees one?
Thank you.
Mr. Scunzio, no objection, full? Thank you. Any other questions of the committee?
Mr. Welch, you have the floor. Did you have any other questions at this time?
I'm all done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. Mr. Roth?
Thank you. Mr. Foley, in your 21-year career in the district, 18 years as principal, have you ever been notified, warned,
Yes.
discussed with, reviewed about your use of the email system, any inappropriate use over that time, anything in your record that would say that this has been an issue in the past?
No.
Would you say that the punishment has fit the crime here?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Anyone else at this time? Just have one last question, not so much of a question, just looking for some clarification. I believe earlier the superintendent testified as to stickers that were placed on the walls around the high school. It's my understanding through the testimony that I don't believe I ever heard the superintendent make the accusation that Mr. Foley made the stickers or distributed the stickers or had anything to do with that nature of it. I believe what was said was, as the lead administrator of the building, it was brought to Dr. Thornton's attention by complaints from staff and parents that these stickers were stuck around the high school during the day. And upon investigating, the superintendent mentioned in touring the high school that evening, stickers were still up and being removed by custodian staff. I guess through his questions led him to believe they were up during the course of the day. I believe the question was, or the comment was, as the head administrator of the building, these stickers are about the building during the day, regardless of what they say. You had no knowledge that these stickers were placed around the building in the course of the school day? I don't think the question, or I don't think the accusation was that you distributed them or that you made them or advocated in any way to have to do with their distribution. I think the concern was that this was going on throughout the day in your building and you had no knowledge of it or did nothing to rectify it during the course of the day? I'm looking for clarity on that.
I go around the building every day. I did not see them publicly displayed, although I found out after the fact they were. I told my fellow administrators at the end of the school day if they found them, or my custodial staff coming on a second shift or a third shift, to please make sure they're removed. They did that, and they told me that they were very easy to take down because I guess they're for bumper stickers more than anything else, so they didn't leave a big, they were very easy to take it off.
The superintendent testified that the custodian told him there were over 24 stickers that he had taken down at that point, and he was still at that time removing stickers. So in your tour of the building during the day, you didn't see over 24 stickers?
I did not know. Not during the school day. Okay, but
Thank
what happens, well, what happens many times at the end of the school day, kids upon leaving will do those kind of things.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Roth?
I just want to follow up to this point about the bumper stickers. On the note of October 30, Mr. Foley, the letter from Dr. Thornton to you, I was wondering how you would interpret this passage. This past week, you've distributed in a school letter outlining your position in oversight, activity count, blah, blah, blah. Sorry about that. And you have allowed bumper stickers to be sold on your behalf. Additionally, you have allowed these bumper stickers to be placed on the walls of the high school. How would you interpret the words, "you have allowed"?
Well, I interpreted them as he was stating to me that I had supported and condoned those actions. And I let him know by communicating that I had not whatsoever.
In what manner did you communicate to the superintendent that you disputed that was phrase?
I called him on the phone. I had the parent in question, when I found out about it, who made the bumper stickers up, call him on the phone. And I made sure that it was clear to Dr. Thornton that I had nothing to do with that particular matter.
Do you feel the issue of the bumper stickers has been a material point in what has brought us here tonight?
It's one of the things. I did send a letter to the superintendent refuting those particular charges related to that.
Okay, and the discussion you had with the superintendent was after the letter of the 30th?
Yes.
Okay. And at any time during the period of time in which these bumper stickers went up and the superintendent performed his investigation and you were operating within the schools, did either of you talk about the issue of the bumper stickers directly?
Not until after I
And then
received
say, hey, Jerry, what's the deal with the bumper
Not
stickers?
until after I received the letter.
Okay, so that happened in a vacuum. You both did your own thing. The first thing you heard about the superintendent's issue of the bumper stickers was the notification of the 30th of November in writing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Before we proceed, I'll ask if there's any other questions for Mr. Foley from committee members at this time. Okay. Do you have a question?
The letter is in as a full zip.
I have a question.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
I asked if I could, I needed an opinion on this.
Mr. Welch, I believe you had a question that...
Yes, would, Mr. Foley, would you please
Does anybody have
get a copy of the letter of December 16th, your request for a hearing? for reinstatement? Would you please read the paragraph at the bottom, starting out with "furthermore" out loud, please?
Furthermore, the statements Dr. Thornton made in support of my non-renewal would cause the average person to believe that the high school was in imminent danger of failure. This was not true. Prior to November 24, 2009, neither Dr. Thornton nor any member of the administration or school committee had identified the issues regarding graduation requirements, decap testing, or evaluations as problems that required my attention. The faculty certainly had a right to know that the school was not endangered. They had worked for far too hard, too long to watch their school's reputation falsely maligned. As we have discovered over the past several days, the high school is not in danger of failing, and in fact continues to be recognized by U.S. News & World Report as one of the top 500 high schools in the country. At the time of the email, of course, we had not yet received that news.
Do you still believe that statement is true, that paragraph?
Concerning my non-renewal?
Say again, please.
Concerning my non-renewal?
Concerning that statement that you made in that letter.
Microphone.
I think the problem now is that my brother has introduced as a full exhibit, and not for any limited purpose, the correspondence. So I think that the committee can ask questions about it, if they would like to. And I don't think it's possible now to limit those questions.
Will we be able to ask the superintendent the same question?
Mr. Roth, hold on one moment, please.
I believe that the letter has been introduced as employees number one as a full exhibit. I believe that the school committee member is asking for a clarification on an opinion that was rendered in that letter. As of that point in time and as of today, I think that's a fair question to ask. Mr. Foley, would you respond to that question, please?
May I hear the question again?
Sure. Stenographer, would you please read that question back to him? It was Mr. Welch's question.
Yes.
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 minute.
Well, you answered the question. The answer was yes.
I would just caution or warn that I think we're going back to what legal counsel said. I think we're somewhat drifting outside of the scope of tonight's hearing, although this exhibit was entered as a full exhibit, and this is within the documentation of that full exhibit that you had entered and was accepted. However, I would just caution the direction that we're going in at this point, as I do believe we are going outside the bounds of what this hearing is for this evening. So, any other questions?
He has answered the question, though, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions from committee members for Mr. Foley at this time? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Foley.
Mr. McAtee, anything else?
I have no further questions at this time.
Any other witnesses?
No other witnesses, no, sir.
Are we resting?
We rest, yes.
Mr. Scanzio? Rest. Closing statements, gentlemen?
Can I ask my question?
Mr. McAtee?
1 moment, please.
Let's do it right now. Prior to any closing statements, Dr. Thornton, there's a question apparently that is being asked by one of the school committee members regarding, I would hope it's your testimony. Mrs. Page.
Mrs. Page, I believe you said you had a question for the superintendent for some clarity on his earlier testimony.
Yes. Earlier, at the break, I specifically spoke to Dr. Thornton about which principal I meant to help him recall. And my question that I asked was that if you were employed by North Kingstown when we received complaints from teachers about a particular principal.
We did have a few emails come in at one point. It resulted in a level 3 grievance at the school committee level.
And as I recall, the emails were quite specific about the complaints on disciplinary actions that the teachers had received from the principal.
I don't recall the detail of the emails. I do recall the grievance procedure.
But the teachers were not disciplined for any of the emails that they sent to the school committee or the administration.
The emails I received were union-based, concerned about an issue at a building.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Thank you, Dr. Thornton. Okay.
Larry, if there's no objection, I had 2 follow-ups I'd like to ask the superintendent before we close.
I think it's important that this be put on the record. Mr. Roth, is it a follow-up to a question that was just asked?
Or to his testimony, I had 2 additional points I'd just like to clarify, if that's possible. I appreciate it.
I think we're at a point where we're going to continue this.
I will be very brief. It's 2 simple questions.
Mr. Chairman?
I appreciate the latitude, Larry.
I would just ask that you
Make it real brief, I promise.
brief and stay within the bounds of prior
Got it.
testimony, please.
Sure, and just within the bounds of what we're discussing tonight, right, it's the disciplinary hearing. Real quick, Dr. Thornton, do you harbor any personal animus towards Mr. Foley in any way?
I do not.
Is there any reason to believe that after the suspension that you allow him to come back to work? And if the committee takes this action tonight, whatever reason, is there any reason to expect that you'll allow him to come back to work and finish his contract after that period of time?
Following the suspension, if it was served, I have no grounds to keep the principal out. He would be served, and that would be the end of it.
So after a 30-day period of suspension, you would say there would be nothing stopping you from allowing him to finish that contract?
There would be no legal recourse for me to stop that from happening.
Would there be legal recourse on the part of any of these processes or the committee or anything that you would think of that would stop him from coming back to work?
I think the question's been asked and answered by Dr. Thornton. Dr. Thornton, the sum and substance of your question, your answer is, once the suspension is served, Mr. Foley would have every right to come back to his position. Am I correct?
That's correct. That's the law.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton.
Thank you. Gentlemen, closing statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Jerry Foley has been the principal of North Kingstown High School for the last 18 years. North Kingstown High School has been named as one of the top 500 schools in the country. It is one of the top 2 high schools in the state of Rhode Island. You see all these people sitting behind me here who have come out to support him tonight. Are you really going to suspend him over this, over something small and silly like this? Now, assume for a second that he violated the email policy. He's not the first person to have done it, but he'll be the very first person who's suspended. And he's suspended for one reason, because the superintendent of schools doesn't like what he said. There is no clearer violation of the First Amendment than that. I'm asking you here, ladies and gentlemen, to set aside any personal feelings, good or bad, that you have of Mr. Foley. I'm asking you here tonight to set aside the issue of the non-renewal or the renewal of his contract. This is not about that. This is about this is about a person who nobody knows the students of North Kingstown High School better than Jerry Foley. We have no doubt that the interim principal has worked tirelessly and competent on their behalf. It is not about them. But it is simply unrealistic to expect that somebody who has been here for 2, going on 3 months, could have the same knowledge and familiarity with the school's students, faculty, parents, staff, as somebody who was given the last 18 years of their life serving this community. Simply put, nobody knows these students better than Jerry Foley does. Mr. Foley knows which students need to be pushed, and he knows which students need a pat on the back. Mr. Foley knows which students, what the interests of the students are. He knows what they tune out. He knows what turns them off. He knows what they want to hear. He knows what they need to hear. This spring, you have another senior class that is preparing to graduate. They need their principal back. They need you to return. They need the man who, as past practice, has met with the so-called at-risk seniors and have guided them in making sure that their PBGR requirements are met, sitting down and making sure that they're able to graduate on time. You have a junior class that needs to make sure their e-portfolio presentations are completed by June. Nobody knows that more than Jerry Foley. And it's no slight on anyone else, but they can't. How could they? Ultimately, it's the students of North Kingstown High School who pay the price every day this man sits out. He needs to go back to work to perform his teacher evaluations, a job best suited to somebody who understands the strengths and weaknesses of all the players. He needs to go back for the seniors who we used to sit with during lunch. The friendly principal taking time out of his busy day to sit with during his lunch. They need their principal back. They need their mentor and their advisor back. They need their friend back. It has been more than 2 months since he has been put out on administrative leave. It is time to give these kids back their principal. I want to reiterate once again tonight that if you vote to accept the recommendation of Dr. Thornton that you suspend Mr. Foley for 30 days, you will be the first ones to do it, and you'll be setting a dangerous precedent. I also want to reiterate the points I've already made before, that there was absolutely no progressive discipline in this case. There was no warning about the use of the email system. Dr. Thornton never warned him about using the email system. Now, he says he does. He says he did in the October 30th directive that he sent out, asking Mr. Foley not to use school property and school time to promote his own cause. Of course, during that, as we've said, the purpose for bringing his reasoning for that directive, in part, were these bumper stickers, which Mr. Foley had nothing to do with. He didn't distribute them. He didn't pay for them. He didn't hang them up. In fact, he told you that once he learned of their existence, he directed somebody else to take them down. This bumper sticker issue, by the way, shouldn't be used against Mr. Foley. This demonstrates the close bond that Mr. Foley has with his students, the loyalty and respect they have for him, and the loyalty and respect he has for them. That is not something to be punished, ladies and gentlemen. That is something to be celebrated. I don't know how many school districts have that type of relationship, but you ought to embrace it, not run from it. Now, as I'll reiterate again, the directive October 30th was that Mr. Foley not use school time and school property to garner support for his position. He did not do that. He sent an email that was off school time. It was sent before the start of school. You can't silence somebody. You can't silence somebody's speech. Not when others are allowed to make statements. Should he have to sit home and keep quiet? That's not fair. Also, ladies and gentlemen, and I've used it a few times tonight, and please indulge me for a short time longer, this is clearly a violation of the First Amendment. Dr. Thornton is sent home Mr. Foley, first of all, on a due process. Putting that aside, Dr. Thornton sent Mr. Foley home because he was trying to garner support for his position, according to Dr. Thornton. There are other people who have used the email system for a number of reasons. You heard some of them from Mr. Foley. The tickets to events, selling cars, renting condos, things along that line. They were not suspended. They were not sent out indefinitely? Because understand, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about Mr. Foley being sent home because he used the school email system for personal reasons. This is because Dr. Thornton doesn't like what Mr. Foley said. That is content-based discrimination. That is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And I've got to tell you, folks, it's not even close. It is perfectly acceptable for each of you to sit up there tonight and look at that email and say, I don't like what he said, and I don't like what he said it. What you cannot do is you cannot look at that email and say, I don't like what he said, I don't like that he sent it, and I'm going to punish him for it. You cannot do that. That is clearly a violation of the First Amendment. You can't do that, particularly here tonight in this school with students and faculty and parents. This is a good teaching opportunity. It's a teaching opportunity to tell people that the words freedom of speech in the First Amendment mean something more, are just more than just words that we use when they're convenient for us and when they're suitable to meet our needs. You cannot just put them aside at will. Even if you decide you want to follow Dr. Thornton tonight, the First Amendment is staring you right in the face, its hand is out, and it is telling you to stop. We also have the issue of reputation. Mr. Foley has spent 20 years building a reputation in this community. And I think by the outpouring of support you've seen from him tonight, and the number of people who are still here, by the way, at 5 minutes to 9, can demonstrate that he has spent 20 years building up that reputation. Don't throw it away over something as silly as this. Not over sending an email communication to his staff. I urge you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, to set aside everything else. I urge you tonight not to follow Dr. Thornton down this dangerous path. I urge you to use your independence. I urge you to lead on this issue. I urge you to do what is right and what you know is just. I ask you to remember that no one has ever been suspended for this. I ask you to remember that there was no progressive discipline invoked in this case. I ask you to remember, for God's sake, remember the First Amendment on this issue. We are asking tonight, and we are expecting, ladies and gentlemen, a vote on this tonight. Mr. Foley has been out of school since last November. Up or down, we need a vote tonight. We need to know where you stand. The people of North Kingstown want to know where you stand. It is time. It is time to stand up and let us know where you are on this issue. Make your vote tonight. Send Mr. Foley back to work beginning tomorrow morning at the start of school. I thank you all very much for your time here tonight.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I have more comments than a closing statement. I wrote a couple of notes to myself during Mr. Foley's testimony. This case is not about a single email. This case is not about a bunch of bumper stickers, which apparently were generated and created and paid for by a parent, given to some students who posted them up. This case is not about a single correspondence that was stuffed into employees' mailboxes. This case is about an entirely different concept. The concept is called insubordination. There was a case that was heard before the Commissioner of Education, Hicks versus Cumberland School Committee. I know that the attorney for the school committee knows it well because he was the attorney who handled this case. And the hearing officer described insubordination as serious misconduct that undermines the authority of those who must manage and direct the school system in an efficient manner. In this case, it concerned the teacher who actually was discharged because the teacher was required by an administrator to produce a report. The response in that case by the teacher, who did not want to do it, simply said, make an appointment with me and we'll talk about it. There was no prior discipline involved in the case. There was no progressive discipline in the case. The teacher was fired. It was sustained by the Board of Regents. That is how important an action of insubordination is in a school district. When employee is allowed to be insubordinate, it destroys the whole chain of command, especially when you have a situation in which you have a principal who is supposed to be helming the flagship of the district, your high school, which is one of the jewels of the district. He decides to take it upon himself to get his personnel matter, his fights with the school committee, his lawsuits against school committee people individually, his filing age discrimination cases. Every time we turn around, there's a new case. And he decides not to defend himself in all the particular courts in which he has filed his actions. He decides to draw in all the students. He decides to draw in all the staff in the high school to buttress support for himself. The other word that I wrote down was incredulous. I sat here incredulous as I asked questions and I heard Mr. Foley answer them. And the testimony that was elicited on direct examination. I'm absolutely incredulous with those responses. That email that was sent out, in his mind, was informational. So it's informational when he calls his bosses, the school committee, bullies. It's informational when he describes to them the fact that he's suing the school committee. It's informational when he says this is round one, round two is about to start. It's informational when he says he's hired an attorney to go after the school committee. What could the intent and purpose of a correspondence like that be to send to your staff, except to create division, except to draw them away from their chief responsibility, which is teaching and learning in this building? At a time, as we all know from past meetings, where this school, based on the PBGR requirements, is in serious jeopardy. At a time when you know that your assistant superintendent had to be directed to come into this school to start to pull this school together to meet those requirements, so you could lose the right to issue diplomas. At a time when you've received a letter from RIDE, which basically says, under this principal's stewardship of this school over the past couple of years, you've had no progress in a number of very important areas towards PBGRs. Why would you send a letter like that out? The fact that you'd send a letter like that out and you'd have the chutzpah to sit here and just say that it's informational is unbelievable. The fact that you'd say, I received this letter from a superintendent that says I'm directing you to cease and desist any further involvement of students and staff on your behalf, and he didn't see a conflict with what he did in terms of sending that email out, and that directive that he got is incredible. I'm sorry, it's just not to be believed. It is not truthful. It's a fiction. Just like a claim of I have a First Amendment right to hold individuals under my control, my employees, captives, and force them to listen to my opinion of the actions of the school committee and what my personnel action is about, is incredible. I've never seen a situation like this in 28 years of practicing law, where an employee gives you that kind of testimony and has said in such a bald-faced way, there's no conflict between this directive that I got, and I never intended to create any division. I never intended to turn the staff away from either the superintendent or away from the school committee in a way that was so disrespectful. You have no right to hold a captive group of people like that and say I have a First Amendment right to give them a barrage of insults. It's completely inappropriate. It's completely insubordinate. In terms of not knowing in advance, he has a letter dated October 30th. This man got a free pass on the first occasion. He was involved in 2 instances which were inappropriate. He allowed those bumper stickers to stay in the school all day long. He hand-wrote a letter, which was almost as disrespectful as the email, to every single member of his staff. Inappropriate. What did the superintendent do if he had such animus? Did he punish Mr. Foley? No. He set a level of expectation, which is very clear in that letter on October 30th. What did Mr. Foley do? He disregarded the letter. And then he says, I can say anything I want to my staff. I could bring my own personnel matters before them. I could try to divide them, split them in half. I could get people who think that I'm great, and I could bring them to a school committee meeting, and I could try to convince them that I was just giving out information. I don't believe anybody in their right mind would think that he was telling the truth on that stand. Frankly, I wish the superintendent had recommended that you terminate him tonight. That testimony was completely inappropriate. All you have to do is compare what the superintendent testified to and his principal testified to, and you know that he's not telling the truth. There's just no basis to find anything else, in my opinion. It's a fairly easy decision based on the insubordination and disrespect that was shown to this committee as well as to the superintendent in terms of violating this directive and trying to pull this staff into his personnel matter that he should be suspended for a minimum of 30 days. What troubles me is he's now facing a 30-day suspension on progressive discipline. The superintendent figured that that would be enough for him to learn his lesson. I wonder whether that's enough now for him to learn the lesson. What he did was actually inappropriate. He testified the only reason why he wouldn't send the letter out again is because he didn't want to sit on his thumb for two months before he'd get a hearing before this committee. Not that what he did was wrong. He testified he doesn't think his letter was inappropriate. I don't know whether progressive discipline works in this case. But we have made a recommendation to you. The 30 days is, in my opinion, after this testimony, more than generous. And we hope you'd see that the same way as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The committee has previously agreed to continue discussion and deliberations of the committee in open session. So we will of course, adhere to that. Before the committee enters into discussion or deliberations, which I'm certain will do, I'll ask of the committee, based on the presentation and the testimony that we've heard this evening, the recommendation that's been given this evening, is the committee prepared to offer a motion at this time? Mrs. Avezzano?
I'd like to make a motion to accept the superintendent's recommendation.
Then a motion made to accept the superintendent's recommendation for a 30 working day unpaid suspension. Is there a second to that motion? Mrs. Brunel?
I'll second it.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Motion's been made and seconded.
The recommendation also included the letter of reprimand being placed in the personnel file.
Yes, Mrs. Avezzano's motion was to accept the superintendent's recommendation, which the record is would include the letter of reprimand in his file. So we've had a motion that's been made and that's been seconded. At this time, we can have discussion or deliberations from the committee on that motion. And I'll open up. Mrs. Avezzano?
Yes, thank you. I basically concur that this issue that's before us is not small, nor do I think it's silly. I think principals of schools are in leadership positions. They're leaders of their schools and of their buildings, and as such, there's an obligation, particularly when students are involved. Mr. Foley may have provided a good example in other ways as a friend and a mentor to students, but the simple fact is that we all have an obligation when we have a job, and that is we have to obey our bosses. Everyone knows, everyone here that has a job, particularly in the private sector and everywhere, knows when your boss gives you an order, you need to follow that order. And I agree that what we're talking about is insubordination. In terms of First Amendment arguments, I think with the First Amendment, there's also restrictions based on time, place, and manner of your speech. So while we all may be free to say what we want and what we feel, you don't always have that right to do it where and when you choose. this is a very unfortunate situation that we all find ourselves in, but I think it's important that we support and reinforce the leader of this district, Dr. Thornton, who's trying to lead us towards bettering the educational system, and as such, his employees need to follow his directives. In terms of one of the warnings that were given to Mr. Foley, the letter stated that you're not to advocate for yourself on school grounds. It was done on school grounds in his office. We're splitting hairs when we talk about whether it was before school or when the bell rings. The bell's ringing is for the student. The employees are at work and have obligations as an employee from the moment they step onto the school grounds, in my opinion. Again, as I said, it's nothing anyone enjoys. It's an unfortunate situation, but I think we have to support the leader of the district. The testimony that Mr. Foley gave about collaboration and cooperation, again, I just can't accept that given his behavior. And as I said previously, the testimony and the behavior don't jive. Being a principal is about cooperation, it's about teamwork, it's about putting students first, and I don't believe that what happened here was an example of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Avisano. Anyone else for discussion on the motion on the table, Mr. I'm sorry, did your hand go up? No?
Up here first, waiting to see.
Okay. Anyone else? Discussion on the motion on the table. Mr. Roth.
Thanks. I want to thank everybody involved tonight, Council, Mr. Foley, Dr. Thornton, and the public who is attending tonight. You know, I agree with some of the comments that committee members are making. You know, I can look at this for what it is and say, you know, was there a lapse in judgment on the part of some of the parties? I would probably say yes. And that when I asked the question, knowing if you knew then what you know now, would you send this? I accept that. I also think that common sense and common decency has left these proceedings months ago, long before a lot of these events have happened. And that I also believe that the events that have led up to this event of November 25th has put the principal justifiably under pressure that a lot of people might not be able to understand. So I'm just looking at this, and I'm not going to quibble about points of law. I'm going to try and take this from a sense of common sense and common decency, and that if you have a lapse of judgment, which we can accept, and if both men say that they don't harbor personal animus towards each other, and that we can recognize that the principal has had a record of service for this school and for this community that has been pretty much unparalleled over 2 decades, that if we can't get by this, then there's something wrong with all of us. And the community here to see this probably concurs with that statement. I take it at the word of both people here that they don't harbor animus, that there is no reason that Mr. Foley can't resume his function as principal of the school, and that we don't need to continue to pay 2 principals for this purpose. I can honestly say I do think that there was a lapse in judgment. I do think that he when I was CC'd on it, I read it, and my first instinct was, oh boy. And I knew within minutes the events that were going to transpire later that day. I didn't voice them to anybody, but my personal feeling was that Dr. Thornton was going to take a job action immediately against Mr. Foley. I told people close to me, I predicted it, by noon he would be gone, and he was. And that is nothing, and I'm not sitting here saying that I'm smarter than everybody else, but I have seen this coming for months. That it, just as a simple viewpoint for me watching this as a bystander, that one person was looking for a reason, any reason to take a job action, and you gave it to him. And that's what puts us here today. I try to keep a sense of proportion. I try to keep a sense of fairness of where we're at. Let's get by this. We're not talking tonight about his contract extension. We're talking about this suspension. To that point, if there's a motion on the floor and it's been seconded for acceptance of this punishment, which includes a 30-day suspension, I'm going to offer an amendment at this point to consider time served of 77 days from November 25th as the timing element to that, and I'm looking for a second at this time.
I would give a second to that.
Motion made, there's amended motion made, I'm sorry, and there's a second to that. Any discussion on the amended motion?
I'll continue if,
You gonna continue on your
yeah, if that's okay.
Sure.
The amendment's common sense. You're asking for a 30-day suspension. He's been out for 77 days. Semantically out. Vacation, administrative leave, suspension. I'm going to go with, in my understanding, the word suspension in the letter that came out. He's already been suspended. You've asked for 30. He's been out for 77 days. So I think under any circumstances, if the committee wants to deliberate fairly here, I think the timing element of the request has been served, and that under any circumstances, I would expect that man to be principal tomorrow morning, based on what Dr. Thornton said, that after the penalty has been served, that under law and under any circumstances, there's nothing stopping anybody from restoring him to his job. So I would say under just common sense and common fairness, with this whole community watching and that camera running, watch. You're asking for 30. You've had 77 days. The amendment is pretty straightforward. I ask for your support tonight, school committee.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Amended motion has been made and seconded. If there's no further discussion on the amended motion, I'll call the vote on the amended motion. Mrs. Page, you have discussion on the amended motion? We will continue discussion on the main motion, but if there's discussion specifically on the amended motion, you can certainly, we can certainly entertain that at this time. Do you have discussion on the amended motion?
I do have discussion on the amended motion. I think that the amended motion follows along with the spirit of what Dr. Thornton has stated, that he wanted some sort of a suspension, because I do think that the email that was sent out was inappropriate. We are allowed as a school district to monitor and regulate the email that is within our system. We state that very clearly in our email policy, and we also state the repercussions if you violate that very clearly. The repercussions can be anywhere from some sort of a verbal reprimand to taking away your email privileges. And that's all that we do under the policy. The October 30th letter that has been submitted states very clearly that Mr. Foley is not to be having activities on his own time, or I should say, it is to be on his own time and is to be off school grounds. However, I do think there needs to be a sense of proportionality here, and so that would be why I think that 77 days that have already been served, and I didn't calculate them, I'm just going by what Mr. Roth has just stated a moment ago, would be, I think, in proportion with what has gone on, and so that would be the reason I would support the amended motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Before we call the question on the amended motion, is there any further discussion on the amended motion that's on the table? Hearing no further discussion, Mrs. Jarrow, roll call vote on the amended motion on the table, and if you could please read that amended motion back for the record.
Amendment to consider time served of 77 days from November 25th, 2009 to date, and add that as a timing element. April Brunel.
No.
Larry Cerisi.
No.
Kimberly Page.
Yes.
Douglas Roth.
Yes.
Richard Welch.
No.
Linda Avanzado.
No.
Julia Held.
Yes.
Motion fails 4-2 with one from Jamestown. Actually, the vote doesn't count. 4-2. The amended motion has been defeated. The main motion is now on the table. We can certainly have further discussion on the main motion that's on the table. Any further discussion on the main motion that's on the table? I believe we've heard from Mr. Roth and Mrs. Advisano so far. Would anyone else like to speak on the main motion? Mr. Welch.
In typical fashion, things have been said at this table just a short bit ago about the conduct of this committee, which I take exception to. That's one person's opinion who likes to play to the audience that's here. The fact of the matter is, I think a ninth grade student would read the letter from Dr. Thornton and understand that if I did anything at all in regards to the communications that Jerry Foley sent, I was being insubordinate. I take exception to someone coming in front of me with these letters and stating their information only. I cannot support the request to have this denied. I'm going to follow the suggestion of the superintendent. I think that all of you folks have to understand that work in the private sector, that when your boss gives you a directive, if you don't like it, go home, find another job. But you don't turn around and throw it in his face. Thank you.
Embarrassment. We're going to work our way down the table, and I hope, Mr. Roth, I just hope we can kind of be brief and conclude the discussion on the main motion that's on the table.
Yeah, I'm going to offer another amendment that if this takes place, the vote goes through on the main motion, that what is 30 days from this date? Today's February 9, so we're looking at March 8, is it?
30 working days.
30, it's 30 days. It's a 30-day suspension. Has that been specified that it's now 30 working days?
Unpaid leave, 30, that's working days.
So what is the calendar date that this will end?
Anybody have a calendar with them?
Is there a calendar handy? Deb, do you have Outlook on your machine? The motion, the amendment I'd like to make is that after 30 working days, whatever this decision is going to be, that all impediments to returning Mr. Foley to work at that time will cease, and he will be allowed to come back to work at that time. So if it's going to be 30 working days, I don't know, I'd like to get the calendar date just to make sure that
I believe it is March 25th.
What would that be?
March 25th. That is counting the days, it is not counting President's Days, but it is counting these winter break days, which I believe are administration work days.
Okay, so accepting March 25, my amendment will read that upon March 25th, and after service of this penalty, Mr. Foley will be returned to his position as principal of the high school. I would like a second to that.
Second.
There's been an amended motion made that's been seconded. Any discussion on the amended motion? Mrs. Advisano.
I'm just not going to support a hypothetical motion, so just...
It's not hypothetical.
Thank you, Mrs. Advisano. Thank you, Mrs. Advisano. Mrs. Held.
As sort of an observer to these proceedings as well as others, I think one thing that I would really hope we could all try to encourage, no matter how these votes come out, is respect. Respect, or the lack thereof, has been an issue in multiple directions. I think the communications that were sent by Mr. Foley evidence a lack of respect for the leadership of the district. I think some of the questions and some of the answers that people provide to each other, the audience evidences some lack of respect as well. We need to be better models for our young people about how to conduct ourselves. And I hope that whether this suspension is for whatever number of days, I do think that the leadership of the district needs to be supported in its efforts to improve the district. And I would hope that we could all treat each other with a little more respect than sometimes seems to be evident.
Thank you, Mrs. Held. Very well said.
Excellent
Any further discussion on the amended motion? Mrs. Page?
The reason I would support the amended motion is it gives a definite, what do we do next at the end of the 30 days? And I think that's one of the things that is a question here that is not clear from the proceedings that we've had here tonight, nor where we're going next. And so that would be why I would support it, to say a definite what will happen after the disciplinary hearing.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Any further discussion on the amended motion? I will say this. Certainly, we can take a vote on the amended motion on the table, but I think the amended motion violates the purview of the school committee. As the superintendent said earlier in his testimony, is that according to the law and according to Mr. Foley's contract, he will be allowed to return to work if the recommended suspension from the superintendent is imposed by this committee. I think I clearly heard the superintendent say that in his testimony. As far as what his role or what his position will be, that doesn't fall under the school committee's purview. That falls under the superintendent's purview. And I will tell you, this committee's been down this road before. I feel we're clearly overstepping our bounds, this committee, and moving into the day-to-day operations that the superintendent has purview over. So for that reason, I'm going to be voting no on the amended motion. But we can certainly take the vote. Any further discussion? Mrs. Jarrow, roll call vote, please.
April Brunel. No. Larry Cerisi.
No.
Kimberly Page.
Yes.
Douglas Roth.
Yes.
Richard Welch.
No.
Linda Avanzado.
No.
Julia Held.
No.
Motion fails 4-2. Back to the main motion that's on the table. We've had a motion that's been made. We've had a motion that's been seconded, and we can continue discussion on that. I believe we were working our way. Mr. Roth was last left off with comments. I believe we were moving down.
Yeah, I would close really briefly, and then I'm done on the issue. No more amendments to make. Julie, I agree with your notion about respect, but our votes and our actions are self-evident. And we'll watch what happens and how this plays out. And I won't be supporting this motion tonight. I don't care, Dick, if I'm playing to the crowd. I'm sorry.
No, you're not.
It's my purview. I'm allowed to say it. It's not out of lack of respect. I'm just really, really sorry that we exist in such a state of division that we can't get by this.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Mrs. Held, did you have anything further you'd like to say? Thank you. Mrs. Avanzado?
I just want to say I very much agree with and appreciate Mrs. Held's comments. And just in closing, in terms of what testimony we heard here tonight, that is part of what troubles me, and what Mr. Scungio referred to is another opportunity here to tell it like it was and what really happened and what occurred. And in terms of that email being purely informational, I'm sorry, I just can't accept that. That doesn't jive with the facts and circumstances as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Avanzado. Mrs. Page?
No, I don't think I have any further.
Thank you. Mrs. Brunel?
Unfortunately, Mr. Foley's comments that this letter was purely informational does not sit well with me, because he's responsible as to what information he does put out. Yes, it is information. What kind of information? It does not pertain to teaching and learning. And that's exactly the complaint we received from teachers. I will be supporting the superintendent's recommendation.
Thank you, Mrs. Bruno. Anyone else? Just a couple of quick closing comments before we call a vote on my part. I just want to recognize and thank Mrs. Held for the comments that she made earlier. I think it was well said and really means a lot. And I think she was in attendance at our meeting here just a week ago, where the same cafeteria was packed with parents and students that were here for K-5 configuration, an educational topic. I know that's boring to some, but we were actually here for an educational topic. And although there were some parents and students in the audience that night that agreed with the committee's work, and they agreed with the superintendent's work, and there were others who didn't agree with the superintendent's work and the committee's work, The whole 4-hour evening was polite, respectful, no catcalls from the audience, no speaking while others were speaking. And I really wish some of you that were in attendance here that evening are also in attendance here that night. So I'm sure you can appreciate the difference in the atmosphere. And it's really concerning. As far as the comments pertaining to tonight, we've heard comments from committee members about a lapse of judgment. Lapse of judgment once, maybe twice, but when you get to 3 and 4 times lapse of judgment on the same matter, to me, that's no longer a lapse of judgment, that's malicious and willful. Following the directions of legal counsel tonight, focus primarily on the evidence and the exhibits and the testimony that we hear tonight and nothing outside of that. The email that was sent was not, it was described as an isolated event or one email. Well, this is all about an isolated event or one email. It's not. Clearly the testimony and clearly the evidence that's been presented, this is based on a chain of events, starting with the October 29th letter, moving into the November 25th letter, moving into the complaints that we received from parents and staff members about the letters and about the stickers. Nothing being done to remove the stickers. I call it deliberate indifference. I didn't see them. What's more concerning to me than all of that is we can work past that. We can collaborate. We can work together. We can move past that, move forward. Certainly we can. I think the superintendent has expressed that. I think Mr. Foley has expressed that, and I think my colleagues have expressed that. But here in this testimony tonight, again, a refusal to take any responsibility or accept any fault of his own. Instead, he was chosen to cast aspersion and blames upon the school committee members and the administration. That's where my biggest concerns are, not for what we've seen over the past couple of months, but for what are we going to see moving forward if still tonight, in the face of all this, there's no acceptance at all. We've talked about First Amendment rights violations. We've seen letters in the newspapers, comments in the newspapers. Some of them have been my own. That's your First Amendment right. And nobody's objecting to that. Nobody takes issue with that. Some of them have been Mr. Foley's. Nobody takes issue to that or objects to that. But violating a school department policy that clearly delineates what the email system and the network system is allowed use for, that's not exercising your First Amendment right. So, therefore, as I said, I'm going to support the motion that's on the table, and I'm more concerned with where are we going moving forward when still, there's been no acceptance or no responsibility taken for actions. So we had a motion on the table. It's been seconded. We've had discussion from the committee members. Mrs. Jarrow, could you please call a roll call vote? Could you read the motion back and call a roll call vote, please?
Motion to accept the superintendent's recommendation for a 30-working day unpaid suspension and letter of reprimand to be placed in Mr. Foley's personnel file.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarrow. Roll call vote, please.
Linda Avanzado.
Yes.
April Brunel.
Yes.
Larry Cerises.
Yes.
Kimberly Page.
No.
Douglas Roth.
No.
Richard Welch.
Yes.
Julia Held.
Yes.
Motion approved 5-2. Thank you.
4-2.
I'm sorry. 4-2. Motion passes. At this time, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 7-0. We're adjourned.
They already did.
Well, no, they recessed.